Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, mispronounce anything, and for any noises in the background while reading this work. This is Chapter 6, Part 4 of Passerine. Same trigger warnings apply from the last. Philza had no idea what was going on. All he knew was that every instinct in his body was telling him to fight, to reach for the sword strapped across his back and draw it against the smiling man at the other end of the aisle. But he also knew that beside him, Wilbur and Techno were standing, transfixed, and it was not his call to make. The two of them were twin students, waiting for answers from a far wiser teacher, and Philza could understand that desperation, that ceaseless drive to find answers to whatever means necessary. He'd found himself lost in that feeling for nearly a decade. Wilbur and Techno had been waiting for this conversation all their lives, and they hadn't even known. Phil was not going to take that chance away from them, no matter how much he wanted to drag them both away from here, so he stood his ground and he listened. Dream's knowing smile seemed to be directed straight at him. "First things first," said the green god, leaning back on his bandaged hands and considering the three of them carefully. "I think you must have noticed this already, even if none of you had the words to name it. This is not the first story told. This is not your first life, nor will it be your last." Out of the corner of his eye, Phil saw Wilbur stiffen and Techno jerk forwards. He moved discreetly closer to them, a hand on the pommel of his sword, even as his head swam with the green god's words. Dream's smile only widened. "You are royalty now, but before you were simple soldiers, sometimes strangers on your own separate journeys, sometimes rebels against a shared cause, sometimes happy. But more often than not," he gave a soft laugh, "there was one time you were enemies, tearing each other apart until there was nothing left but bones." "What in the world are you talking about?" Techno demanded, his red eyes blazing, incensed by the very notion of standing on the side where Wilbur was not. "I was talking about different plays, Technoblade." Dream spread his arms wide as if welcoming them all home. "Different stages, different actors, different scripts, but all the strings lead back to me." Philza did not want to believe it, but even as he stood there with his heavy disbelief, his mind raced through all the times he'd felt like 10 different people trying to live in one body. An echo, not a voice. He thought about all the dreams of finding Wilbur in a dark room, of Tommy standing on a bridge that went on until the very edge of the world, of Techno watching him from an island in the sky, all of them terrified and too real to be dreams. If that was true, then Phil's bones were older than he thought. He had always been dancing to someone else's song, over and over and over and over again. When Wilbur spoke again, his voice was a fractured mess. "So everything has been you all along?" "No." Dream's expression was full of mocking pity. "Not everything, just the big things. All the small, intimate details, all the character, that was you. To put it bluntly, Wilbur, I may have put those soldiers in your path, but it was still your choice to carve a bloody path through them. It was still you that sounded that horn, still you that pressed that button." He shrugged. If you're looking for absolution, you won't find it here. And the voice, oh, that?" Dream's grin was laced with venom. "Honestly, I just wanted to screw with you. I had to have some fun for myself while I waited in the wings." Philza turned to Technoblade and Wilbur. They were already looking at each other, their faces a reflection of each other's. In all the world, they were the only two who could truly understand each other in this. Philza was merely the witness. He'd seen Techno pull his hair out in anger. He'd seen Wilbur lose weeks of sleep, seen them both unravel at the seams over it. Philza himself had burned through libraries and crypts looking for an answer, and now it was here, as simple as it was terrible. The green god was simply bored. "You're a monster," Philza gritted out, his fingernails digging into his palms until they drew blood. "You're a goodness darned frickin' monster." "Oh, I haven't even gotten to the worst part," Dream laughed. "Technoblade?" Technoblade glared up at him, bloody murder in his eyes. "You're the real tragedy here, actually." At that, Dream dropped down from his pulpit, landing soundlessly on the marble below. Techno and Philza instinctively put themselves between him and Wilbur, but the god simply leaned against the first of the pews, examining them with all the nonchalance of a child finding a curious bug crushed beneath his heels. "I almost let you sit this one out, you know. Almost allowed you to a quiet life in the woods with your family." Surprise broke through Techno's fury. but it was Wilbur who spoke up. His family? Oh, sure. Father, mother, siblings, the whole 9 yards. Siblings? Techno finally croaked. 3 sisters, Dream informed him gleefully. 2 brothers. Ah, but then I changed my mind. Couldn't waste all that dormant godhood in you. All the gods are major players, but none of the others are as fun to play with as you. What did you do to them? Techno demanded, stepping forwards. His trident was suddenly in his hands. What did you do to my family? Techno, Phil warned, or maybe it was Wilbur. Dream smiled. The correct answer, he said slowly, is what did you do to them? Techno lunged. They crashed against the marble pulpit with enough force to crack it. Techno had a fistful of the green god's tunic in his hands and his trident in the other, breathing heavily as dust and chips of marble rained down on them both. He could hear Wilbur and Philza calling his name, but every other noise was drowned out by Dream's laughter, a sound that had become so familiar to Techno over the years. He had hated it all his life, and now there was a smug-looking face to attach to it. I told you, Dream spat in his face. I don't call every action, Technoblade. I present the choices, but you make them. I was the voice, but you were always the blood-stained hands. I don't even remember their faces, Techno thought, tightening his hold on the green god's shirt until he could hear it begin to tear. I don't even know their names, and yet he was consumed by it, an anger that felt like all his nerves singing at once, demanding the same thing, vengeance. Fractured light slanted over the 2 gods. The whole world was a broken, miserable thing. Why? Techno hated the despair that bled into his voice, but there was nowhere else for it to go. Why me? Why did you change your mind? He tried searching for sympathy in Dream's face, but all he received was the darkest sort of humor. You can search for meaning all you want, he said. Turn over every rock and read all the stars in the sky, but the truth is, Techno, you were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. All of us, Techno growled, are just helpless insects to your goodness-darned web. Is that it? He thought he might have seen something graver flicker over Dream's face, but it was gone before Techno could put a name to it. Not all of you. Techno was going to kill him. He was going to put his trident through that wicked little grin and be done with it all. But then he felt a pair of hands on his shoulders, pulling him back. Techno, Wilbur's voice, leading him back to his own body like a lighthouse calling a ship to a safer shores. We still need him. He still has to give him back to us. Right. Dream hummed as Wilbur dragged Techno to his feet. You still need me, Techno. Don't you frickin' call me that, Techno spat. They had him surrounded. He was on the floor, leaning against a broken pulpit, and yet the jerk still looked like he held all the cards. Because he did. Techno felt himself sag at the realization. Dream had everything, because he still had Tommy. Dream squinted up at each of them in turn, his eyes finally landing on Philza, who'd drawn his blade. Dream considered the sharp tip pointed straight at him. That's the same sword you killed the war god with, yes? He asked, calmly, as if they were discussing tea. Phil didn't deign to give him an answer. Techno alone recognized the look in Philza's eyes. Philza had never been haunted by voices, but he demanded blood all the same. Did he at least fight well? Dream continued, when it was clear none of them were replying. He must have, if he'd managed to kill your son. You will listen to me, Philza said, his voice as cold and lifeless as the tundra they've ridden through. I do not care about your stories. I do not care about you. But if you have all this power, if you can rewrite history, then you will give me my son back, or else. Or else what? Dream demanded. We've been down this road before, Philza. You have had a million chances to kill me, to end this loop, but still here we stand, still at an impasse. But that wasn't quite true, Techno thought. He makes even the green god afraid. Somehow, despite everything, Philza had the upper hand. But one glance at the man told Techno he was just as clueless as he had been in that snow-covered cave. It was there, the key to everything, nameless and out of reach. What in the world are you, Philza? And another thing, said Dream, slowly getting to his feet. He leaned against his ruined pulpit and considered them all with a strange expression. Giddy, almost. I only rewrite the histories, Philza, plentiful as they may be, but even I do not have the power to rewrite them. Once performed, an action cannot be reversed. Once penned, an ending cannot be restored. Wilbur stiffened. What does that mean? but a monstrous sort of chill had already settled in Techno's soul. Even before, Dream threw his head back in laughter and said, "It means I can't bring back the dead. Your brother's gone. For good." How many times, Philza had often wondered, could a heart break before there were too few pieces to make it whole again? He had seen mortals survive the cruelest of fates. They would lose homes and livelihoods and friends and family, and still they would pick themselves up the next day and soldier on. But there was a breaking point. Philza had witnessed that, too. But when did it come? Was it the second loss, or the third, the sixth? Or did it only take one great tragedy to bring a man to his knees? Even the most fortified wall can break with a single well-placed blow, and even the strongest god can fall with a single well-placed heartbreak. No, Philza's sword nearly slipped from his grip before he tightened his shaking fingers around it once more. "You're lying. You must be." "Why would I lie?" Dream asked, his golden hair still shades darker than Tommy's used to be. "You said it yourself. Resurrecting your son is the only reason you need me. Why would I give that up?" There was a terrible sound, like the screeching of a dying animal. It took Philza a moment to realize it was coming from his own throat. He moved, without thinking, without breathing. He raised his sword high over the head and brought it crashing down on the god that had taken the remnants of hope from Philza's grasp and dashed it against the wall. His blades shattered the marble pulpit, cutting the book the green god had left on top of it into shreds of leather and paper. But when the dust settled, he found Dream standing unharmed a few paces away, looking unimpressed. "I hadn't finished reading that," Dream complained, "and it was just getting interesting, too." And then there was Techno, taking him by the shirt and throwing him through the nearest window with all the force a blood god could muster. He crashed through the stained glass, disappearing into the snow beyond. Philza and Techno were quick to follow. They bounded over the shattered glass, not even feeling it cut through their skin, weapons out and ready to slaughter. This, at least, was familiar. The angel of death and the blood god, raining bloody vengeance. This was their role. This was who they were. Dream had been flung against the wall of a building beside the church. He sat in the rubble like a king, lounging on his throne, his grin as lazy as it was malicious. "So," said Dream, "I take it you're angry with me?" Philza flew towards him, kicking up the cold snow in a violent wave of his wings unfolding. He slammed his foot against the green god's chest, reveling in the sickening crunch that came with its head cracking against the debris. His sword was at the god's throat in an instant, cutting a single red line across the pale skin. "I will enjoy taking you apart," Philza thought. If I shall spend eternity suffering, then so shall you." "I never promised you anything," Dream said quietly, gazing up at Philza. "All that foolish hope. You're the one that went searching for it. You saw patterns in the sky and then blamed the stars for your own wrong interpretation." Suddenly his hands shot out, gripping the blade of Philza's sword and so tightly that the blood dripped down from his palms. With surprising strength, he pushed the blade down until it was resting against his heart instead. "Go ahead, tear through me, but I'm not the one who left one son by his mother's deathbed and forced a crown on the other. I'm not that kind of monster." "He was 15, Philza croaked. "He died for your war at 15. "And you abandoned Wilbur at 15, the green god sighed wearily. "They grow up so fast, don't they? Pity you were only there for the end." He brightened. "Speaking of Wilbur, I never answered his question, did I? Oh, how did I did all this?" He let go of Philza's sword and gestured at everything. The empty town, their shattered universe, their strange story. His shaking hand and prepared to plunge it through the god's heart. After years of fighting, he had figured out exactly where to slice without killing. Death would be too kind to a god than this monster. "Well, you should," Dream laughed. "Look behind you, Philza." Philza would have cut off an arm before he took orders from him, but there was something in his words that made Phil's blood freeze over. Slowly, without moving his sword away from the green god's chest, Phil turned. He saw Techno making his way towards him, his unbound hair falling over his face like a burial shroud, his trident glistening in the dying sunlight as he spun it expectantly in his hands, ready to be Philza's fellow executioner. But then, behind him, standing at the window they crashed through, looking numbly at the scene, was Wilbur. As Philza watched, still as stone, Wilbur slowly drew his bow. A slender hand reached back into his quiver and produced a single arrow. knocked it, and aimed straight at Techno. Techno! Philza screamed in warning. Techno paused, tensing in confusion, and then he followed Philza's frightening eyes towards the church. Phil could see Wilbur's hands shaking, his mouth forming a single word in wide-eyed fear. Techno? Ah, Wilbur, Dream's voice. The voice that had plagued Philza's sons for years. Now plaguing him too, as he found himself unable to move, or blink, or breathe, or think. Why the long face? Wilbur began to smile. Will? Techno asked, uncomprehending. There was no words, no universe, no God-written stage where Wilbur would do this to him, and yet here they were, standing across from each other, strangers once more. That was not his brother's smile. Those were not his brother's eyes. Will? Techno said again. A plea, a prayer, a pardon? Wilbur let the arrow fly.